Welcome back to Portrait of an Editor. I am Francis Lombard. In this episode, Derf Backderf and I dive into the making of Kent State and the skill building and knowledge of the comic book medium he developed that made it possible for him to produce such a complex and comprehensive OGN. Regarding Kent State and Derf's other graphic novel, My Friend Dahmer, we talk about how he used the medium to create unseen moments. We also cover how he protects his physical and mental health while working on such dark topics, and a look at today's social and political turmoil through the lens of the events of the 70s. Finally, we talk about the right wing's cultural warriors' attacks on My Friend Dahmer, libraries, and various other graphic novels. A reminder, please check out the Portrait of an Editor Patreon page. You can find my earlier interviews from all the way back to 2017, and it's just $1 a month to join. Now here's my conversation with Derf. Enjoy. Derf, welcome to Portrait of an Editor. For this episode, we're going a little different. Usually I have an editor on the show, but there's a number of reasons why I wanted to talk to you. One was, and we'll eventually get to it, about the censorship of Mouse, and then when I started reading your tweets that it's actually everybody sounded the alarms once Mouse was being attacked, but this has been something that's been going on. And before we started recording, you were mentioning it's really following a playbook. But also, it sort of got me off my ass to finally really read Kent State. I have to say, My Friend Dahmer, which Alex Schumacher, who I've worked with on Decades of Inexperience, turned me onto your stuff, and I read My Friend Dahmer a while back and thought it was just an amazing piece of work. Shocking, but just I don't know what to say. I'm sorry, I don't want to heap all this praise on it, but Kent State sort of follows up on it, that it's a book that makes you sort of stop and think after you read the last page. And
cool.
And so I wanted to bring you on to talk about Kent State because it really, one of the things about that book, it's like, you're like, what, you can draw the line from May 4th, 1970 to right where we are now.
Absolutely.
Mean, for people listening who haven't made the time to read Kent State, can you just give us like a quick overview of that?
It takes place in May 1970 at the depths of the Vietnam War in Kent State University in Ohio, when an escalating series of anti-war protests over the course of a weekend culminated in the National Guard being sent in by the governor, who was an authoritarian right-wing governor, to crush the protests. And something happened, and the Guard unit inexplicably turned and opened fire into a parking lot full of 500 students, killing 4, shooting and injuring 9, 7 of whom were wounded critically, most of whom had books in their hands. They were walking back and forth to class, not protesting at all. So it was the bloody climax of what was really about 6-7 years of increasing unrest in this country, mainly involving the Vietnam War. But it gets into the larger issues about authoritarianism and overreaction and politics and manipulating media and all that stuff that we're seeing very much in play today. But it was a huge event when it happened. I mean, the entire country basically just froze in its tracks.
It did, okay.
Because this was not at all typical of that time, that, protesters were shot like this. I mean, protesters were certainly beaten and gassed and all that stuff, but to actually kill them, that was really unusual. Mass shootings were rare then, too. I mean, it was not like now where, a younger reader now who grew up with bulletproof backpacks would probably say, yeah, who cares? I mean, we face worse every day. But back then, it was 50 years ago, that was not the case. So, yeah, the entire country just froze. It was, and it had a profound impact on politics and subsequent events in this country, how the Vietnam War was finally wrapped up, and Nixon and all of this stuff. I mean, it just still reverberating today, really. So yeah, it was a great event, and it's just a great story, which is what attracted me to it. And I thought it would make a good graphic novel, and I guess I was right.
And how long did you work on it? I know you're aware of it, been aware of it your entire life, but when did you sit down and go, I got to get this out of my head and on paper?
Yeah, it took 4 years.
Okay.
So 2 years were spent in research, digging through archives, doing all that, interviews and all that stuff I had to do, which is all documented in the back of the book, where there's 30 pages of footnotes.
Yeah.
Listing almost, I'm talking about editing, listing almost panel by panel where the source material came from for what's happening in the book. And then 2 years to draw it. So while I continued to research, I mean, I researched right up almost until the time I turned it in. So yeah, 4 years total. It was a daunting challenge. It's a big book, first of all, almost 300 pages, and very difficult drawing, very difficult research, which is something I enjoy. My background is actually journalism, for years in newspapers, and my degree's in journalism. So it was a chance to use those skills, and I did the same with My Friend Dahmer. I really kind of approached that story the same way.
The one question I've asked a few times on the podcast is, do you just move beyond the research and start working on the story you want to tell? And because of with My Friend Dahmer and also Kent State, there is so much there. When did you, and you said you were researching and also production, did you have to just sort of say, either because of deadline issues or just, I have enough to get moving on this? Was it an internal discussion with you, or was it like deadline issues with your editor and your publisher?
Well, it was both those things. I mean, Kent State had a deadline.
Okay.
So deadlines definitely force your hand. And that last final year with Kent State, I was probably working 7 days a week, 8 to 10 hours a day to finish this book. It was a little tight. And I really could have used another year on it, just to kind of take a little more relaxed pace. But we were trying to get it out in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of the shooting. So that was May 2020. So yeah, I probably got a little bit of a late jump on it when I decided to go ahead with it, and that was my fault. And deadlines have a way, they have a way of forcing your hand. I mean, you got to meet that deadline. Now, it turns out that was because the pandemic hit, the lockdown hit, the release of the book got delayed until the following fall, and so it was all for naught. My Friend Dahmer was different because that was my first book with a major publisher, so it was really open-ended. I worked on that book for 19 years, and it had 4 different drafts before I finally got the draft that I sold to Abrams, who's my publisher. So that was a much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of open-ended process. I wasn't going to let that book go until I finally had this book in my head. I finally got it on the paper, and that took a very long time for a variety of reasons. But people ask me, why did it take so long? And my answer is, it took that long because that's how long it took. I mean, every book is different, right?
Yeah, there's at times that I hear creators beating themselves up about stuff that, can't get it out, can't find a solution, can't find the ending to it, or then you find out it's 10 years later or something. But 19 years later, do you feel that, what was it that you were looking for? Did you ever sort of figure out what you were looking for My Friend Dahmer that made it finally, that you felt it was ready for public consumption?
Yeah, I did. A couple things were happening there. First of all, when I started that process, when Dahmer was arrested, that was 1991. I was a very different author. I was a very different cartoonist. I was doing underground comic strip at that time for those alt weekly papers that used to be everywhere and are no longer anywhere, and having a blast with that. And it was this kind of goofy freeform humor strip, and so I just I'd never tried long form narrative before. I didn't have those skills. I didn't have those drawing skills. drawing style was not appropriate for, a darker story like My Friend Dahmer. So these are all things I had to acquire and had to master, and that took a little longer than I thought it would. I also had to get my head around it. I early on, I just collected material. I figured I'd do something with it eventually, but I wasn't quite sure what. And it wasn't until maybe 98, 99 that I figured, okay, now in my head, I have this concept. I want to do a book. I want to do this standalone graphic novel that tells this story. And graphic novels at that point, believe it or not, really did not exist.
Yeah.
There were only a handful of original graphic novels released every year, and certainly nothing about a serial killer. So I kind of had to wait for the business to catch up to what I was thinking. And eventually it did. But in 1999, that wasn't the case. And I was trying to wrap my head around the narrative, and that took longer than it probably should have. And then finally, like draft number 2 or 3, the light bulb started to flicker on, and I was like, oh, okay, this is what I'm looking for. This is how I should tell this story. And I found the narrative arc. And once you do that, then things start to snap into place.
And how did that carry over into Kent State?
Actually, My Friend Dahmer is the first book I started working on, but it was not the first book that was published. Mm-hmm. That was my debut graphic novel, which is called Punk Rock and Trailer Parks, which is a fictional piece. And that's really where I learned. You learn by doing, and I just sat down and I punched out this book, which is 150 pages, 152, something like that. And it's a self-contained narrative, and it's like it just snapped into place. Like, wow, I'm really having fun with this, and this is how you do it, And so then I took those lessons and applied it to subsequent works. And My Friend Dahmer came out in 2012, I believe, in this country. And then I did a follow-up book, which was called Trashed, which is based on my experiences as a garbage man, also in the same town where My Friend Dahmer took place, though it's fictional, but based on that experience. And that came out in, I think, 2015, and then Kent State was the next book. It was just the next in line. And I kind of have, I keep a list of potential projects. I have, things I want to get to. And Kent State was always on that list. But as I discussed earlier, it was a very daunting project, particularly artistically. And I just didn't feel I had the skills to pull it off. And, before I finally decided, okay, this is the one. That's just skill building. You acquire those skills and you learn and you improve, hopefully, knock on wood. And so I just felt, okay, now's the time. Now's the time to take this on.
Some of the skills that we were talking before we started recording of just taking advantage of the medium, of what it allows you to speed up time, to have various different points of views, also to slow down time, to take a point where you can have a page that's half text with an image.
Right.
Those are the skills you're talking about, like the medium?
Well, those are skills, certainly, that I had to learn. Writing the narrative, where I really learned how to slow things down, was with My Friend Dahmer, because that is such it's a slow, methodical march to the edge of the abyss. And it's got a lot of very reflective scenes, and scenes where, a lot of really kind of spooky, quiet scenes. Coming from comic strips, you have 4 panels or 5 panels, and you've got to make your point, and make your joke, and then get out. So it's like this real, it's almost like rapid fire. And when I took that to my first book, which is just kind of this raucous, really fast-paced story, which is fine because it's about punk rock, so that suits the subject matter. But I knew that coming into My Friend Dahmer, I was going to have to learn how to slow it down, and that's why it took 4 drafts before I finally. The first stories I told with My Friend Dahmer were too cluttered. They were too fast-paced. It was too. It just wasn't. Didn't have enough pauses. And so that's something I had to work on, and I recognized that, and you had to work on it, and then you started stretching it out. And by the time I get to Kent State, I think I've gotten a handle on all that. So I learned how to manipulate pacing. And Kent State's the same way. It has a lot of really quiet moments. And I think and then of course, the climax of each chapter, which takes place over 4 days. Each day has a climax, usually at the end of the day. And so you build toward that climax, and then the next day you start building again. It's kind of this odd narrative arc. But those quiet moments are great because that is where we learn about the people involved in this in the story. The story is told through the eyes and experiences of the 4 kids who were killed, plus one guardsman whose account I had. So you've got these 5 narrative threads. And what I do is I actually put the reader right there on the ground with one of those 5 people, and we kind of walk through the story right by their, right at their elbow. So it's this very personal account of this, this horrible event. But that's where you find the emotional power of the story is through those 5 people, because it's about actual people. And those quiet moments are very important for that, because we learn about their hopes, their dreams, their fears, all that stuff. So, I mean, it's not just throwaway scenes for the benefit of pacing. I mean, everything has a point.
Bring it up to like today, we were talking about sort of this idea of this obsession with guns, the whole thing about violence, in the use of violent words. What your book did at the end is reminded me, and I've had this conversation, with plenty of people about what, especially growing up reading superheroes, what a bullet or a punch or a fall can do to a person.
That's right.
And because of the work and how you slowed things down and how we got to know people, you just realize what one bullet and also what I felt with reading it is that that's it for those people, the 4 people killed. And what you've done, and why I just sort of had to take a breath at the end of it, was you realize that these bullets took away because of what you did in the beginning of just really letting us know that these are real people first, real people, not characters. So you spent so much time letting us know these real people and what they were doing, and then seeing the violence. And the idea of people calling for civil war today, I mean, what are we going to do? Take pot shots at our neighbors? Do we understand what a punch in the head does to a person? Or
no.
But you really, I think everybody should read this book before we start, start talking about violence anymore. But
well, first of all, I don't think the far right really cares.
No, I think they live in a Hollywood movie at times.
With the concept of it. I mean, there's nothing they'd like more than to open fire on a crowd of Black Lives Matters protests. That would be their dream come true. If they think they could get away with it, they would happily do it. So, I mean, the difference between 1970 and now is that now we have a way to, troll the other side, to taunt them, to prod them, to, get their hackles up. Where in 1970, you really didn't have that. I mean, it was every bit as divisive a time, and the sides were every bit as far apart, maybe even more so. But they couldn't communicate with each other like they can now, because the internet didn't exist. So they each existed in their own world, and there was a lot of, I don't know, that was a different dynamic. I mean, the dynamic now is that, the sides seem to enjoy just prodding the other. I mean, that's how they get their rocks off. And the danger comes when it spills over into actual events on the street, like January 6th or some of the other stuff. I mean, just a couple days ago, we had those creeps in a U-Haul who were going to storm a gay pride march and presumably beat the crap out of everybody who got in their way, and the cops stopped them. I mean, that's the kind of thing that, when it moves from concept to reality, that's when the danger happens.
What is the difference between the weathermen who overshadow Kent State with the far right that's now? I mean, the far right talking about the stuff that actually our government did do with embedding agents into these radical groups and trying to stir them up, and also what happened to the weathermen because of the some of the agents. I remember reading in the book of that sort of takeover of the weathermen seemed to be
the playbook's the same. The playbook's the same. I mean, the weathermen, of course, were far radical left, whereas these groups are far radical right. But at a certain point, the right and the left meet, right?
Yeah.
They meet at the same violent apex, and that's really what the weathermen were. I mean, they were moving into the realm of actual terrorism by the time they finally kind of consumed themselves. But the same playbook was employed by the feds, I think, embedding themselves, infiltrating, and then disrupting. That we're seeing that today. The difference is that you wonder, say, with the FBI, whose side are they on? Those guys are pretty reactionary. So certainly the cops, I mean, I don't think anybody really trusts the cops to take on far-right groups. They seem to be pretty buddy-buddy with a lot of those guys. And in fact, there was, where was it, in The Guardian? I think there was an article in The Guardian about how many cops are actually part of these groups that they're, supposed to be policing. It's scary times. Yeah. I mean, it feels more like the Weimar Republic in Germany than it does like 1970, honestly. When you have the far right is just kind of spreading and spreading and spreading, and it's becoming more militarized, and, we know where that led.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what was the final objective of the weathermen? I mean, other than, the
weathermen wanted to be the vanguard. They wanted to set off it was all nonsense.
Yeah.
They wanted to set off an actual revolution in this country. They thought there would be they thought that particularly African Americans would rise up and Latinos would rise up, and that they would start the revolution and the government would eventually topple and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it was just total pie-in-the-sky fantasy. I mean, they dreamed of what happened in Cuba, where there was this scruffy band of revolutionaries in the mountains led by Castro, and then it spread and took over the country. That's what they hoped would happen here. And, of course, it was never going to happen here. But the weathermen were not really clear thinkers. But they were very destructive, and they destroyed, the largest anti-war group in the country, which was SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. They took it over, and they burned it to the ground in the space of like 6 months, which is something we're seeing now. I see that pop up now on the left, let's burn it all down. I mean, what's the point of salvaging anything, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, we've been there before, and you're just playing into the hands of the right at that point.
Do you think their influence on what was going on at Kent sort of, also, or just the background or just the use of them, of the weathermen, and, as the boogeyman out there,
absolutely.
of really got these soldiers into a mind frame that allowed, and
very much so. The weathermen were already gone. They were already banished underground by the time Kent State rolled around, but their specter remained. And Kent State had been a weather stronghold. A lot of the weathermen leaders had spent time at Kent State. They helped organize there. They were buddies with the leadership there. But the leadership at Kent State, I'm talking about SDS at Kent State, that was finished too. Those guys, SDS had been thrown off campus. Their leaders had all been suspended and barred from returning to campus. So it was a spent force. But, people like to use the specter of imaginary demons to further their own ends. We're seeing it today with Antifa. We're seeing it, which doesn't exist either. It exists even less than the weathermen did. The weathermen were actually real. We're seeing it with, BLM. They're burning our cities to the ground. Well, no, they're not. But, it's just this alternate reality that a lot of these people operate, within, that gives them an excuse to bring the boot down. And so that's the same thing we're seeing today.
No, when January 6th occurred, there was this one person I know of who was there, took pictures of being in the building, and when somebody a friend of his started talking about, oh, I heard it was Antifa or BLM being in there causing the riots. He's like, no, it wasn't. I mean, he was like, I'm a oath keeper. We were there. It was this, that. He was like pissed that rumor, even though now his leadership is all doing everything possible.
Yeah.
But the leadership, everybody's like, well, it's still BMM, now with the hearings happening. It's like it was just, we were set up. It was a false flag. He had pride in going into the Capitol.
If he still does, or if he's changed his tune now that the indictments are raining from the sky.
I don't know, but yeah, there's a couple people that I know. He's one, and there's another one who didn't enter the building but was on the outside, and they've twisted themselves into pretzels into believing that they did the right thing.
Right.
And
right. So did the weathermen. Certainly.
Yeah, I was wondering.
Extremists are extremists. I mean, whether they're left or right, they're all kind of wired the same way. They believe that, in the context of whatever great goal they're following, ordinary human life does not matter. And when you twist yourself into that state, you can do some really terrible things.
Now, the pivot and seeing this show is about editors. With you're dealing with such a gigantic tome like Kent State, and with all those strings that you're trying to just make come together, who did you use as a sounding board? Was your editor involved in a lot of things, or it sounds like when we first started talking, there's a self-awareness with how you approach things and how you do the work. I mean, who's also involved in producing some of your stuff, or is it just you're taking it all on and moving forward with it?
It's mostly me. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm the writer, I'm the artist. I've always worked that way. I mean, I think comics are very, at least the type of comics that I've always done are a very private matter. It's one person thinking about something and producing something. So with one of my books, every word, every line, every shade is put there by me by hand. So you get this very personal work at the end of the day. Whereas, mainstream comics, it's a group of people, somebody from Marvel or DC or Image, or even some of the, even Scholastic. I mean, depends on the project, of course. It's almost like assembly line. The pages just go through. They go from writer to artist to inker to colorist to letterer, and then out the back end. And there's an editor that oversees it all. But with me, that's not how it works. And my editor, who's very good, he generally comes in at the end, and he has a very light touch. When he suggests something, it's usually an addition to what I've done. Well, maybe you can put a little more in there. It's like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. So he makes the books better. He doesn't ride herd over what I'm doing. I also have my wife here, who was a journalist for many years, won a Pulitzer Prize, in fact. And she is a footnote nut, so she helped me with the footnotes. She took 4 days off from work and just copy edited the footnotes and really helped me whip those into shape. Which is great. So, I mean, that's basically my support system right there. I mean, beyond that, no, it's all me.
Are you thinking about when you come up to a sequence that this is how I approach it, this is the best way the comics can do it? Or is it just sort of, this is where I'm starting at A and I need to be to Z, and you let your creativity go? Or do you sort of plan out stuff when you're addressing a sequence? Maybe, I guess, for an example, the sequence at the end of the book when the troops turn on the students, and then you really slow things down, and we start seeing you are talking almost a little bit of past, but present and definitely future actions. All of that, if you really sit down and read it, you're experiencing that as a reader on those pages.
That's a multifaceted question.
I know, I'm sorry.
There's a lot of backstory with Kent State because, as I said, it's the bloody climax of 7 years of unrest. So there's a lot to cover there. But the trick was I didn't want to really get bogged down in that, I wanted to just give enough to provide some context without, like about the draft and how that lit the fire to this, this mass unrest in this country, which is really something we haven't seen since the Civil War. As bad as you think 2022 is, or even 2020, 1970 was about 10 times as worse. I mean, it's one of the worst years we've ever had. It was literally campuses in flames, millions on the streets, and crackdowns everywhere. It was horrible. So you have to give some context there to, it's like, here's what happened, here's where we are. But I wanted to tell that story chronologically. I wanted it to feel very much like you're in the moment. So I didn't want to really get bogged down with that. So you have to give just enough. That was a bit tricky. For the end sequence, getting back to comics can tell a story that's unseen.
Yeah.
Particularly on that day, which was Monday, May 4, it was broad daylight. The place was crawling with photographers. Most of them were student photographers because Kent State had a very good photojournalism school. And so there were dozens of people out there taking pictures, and they're great pictures. They're some of the most famous news photos ever taken. But the thing about those pictures is we have thousands of photos up until the moment that guard turns. And then we have that iconic photo of the guard opening fire. And then we have nothing for 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 10 minutes until the photos of the carnage. And then there's all those famous photos of the wounded students and everything else. And the reason for that is because those photographers were in the line of fire, and they very wisely, hit the dirt. And for good reason, because one of the kids who was critically wounded was taking pictures. He was shot in the chest. So what I can do is that I can take all of the information I have, the personal accounts, the morgue reports, the wounded reports, and I can recreate those 5 minutes that don't exist. And that's what you're talking about, those 15 pages of basically people getting shot, which has been described by some critics as Goya-esque, the famous photo, 1812, of Francisco Goya, where the firing squad is about to execute a group of protesters. And I think that's an apt comparison, because I felt it was really important to show that violence. And it is very, very violent, because the attitude in 1970, which we see replicated today, is that, well, we should have shot more of them. We should have shot 1,000 of you to put an end to this period of student unrest in 1970. And we see that today. Well, we should have shot, 100 BLM protesters. We should have shot, this pro-choice march. We should shoot them. Well, it's all right. You believe that. Here's what it looks like. Here's what it looks like when a copper-jacketed bullet over an inch long goes tearing through a parking lot of 500 students, fired from a gun so powerful it can send one of those bullets straight through a foot-thick tree trunk and still kill the person on the other side. Here's what it looks like. And so that's what I did. And I think it's a very powerful walk-off. And really, the book ends almost right after the shooting stops. I mean, that is the walk-off. And that was by design, because narratively I was thinking, I want people to be left with this. I want people to be left with these images kind of burning their eyes. And, when they turn that final page, they just kind of go, holy shit. I mean, that's what I was aiming for. And I think I pulled it off.
And also, then you slap us one more time with the epilogue in the White House, which is just another form of violence. Okay, so do you feel if they killed more students, seeing you research this, would that have put an end to all this? Or do you think...
Well, yeah, probably. I mean,
really?
It had a very chilling effect on the anti-war movement. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the student anti-war movement was pretty much over after Kent State. There was a couple reasons for that. First of all, the draft rules changed. You had a lottery now.
Yeah.
So everybody knew what their chances were of getting drafted, and they could plan for that, And also, the war was starting to wind down. I mean, 70 was one of the worst years of the Vietnam War, and then in 71, Nixon announced that we were going to start winding the war down. It had nothing to do with Kent State. In Nixon's mind, it had to do with 72, which was when he was shooting for re-election. So he ended the war to further his own re-election, which is a truly evil way to wage a war, as if any way to wage war is an evil. But so all those factors combined, and from a student's perspective, given all that, they thought, all right, I'm still opposed to the war. I'm still opposed to the draft, but am I willing to get shot for it? Well, not really.
Yeah.
So the student protests really kind of wound down after that. There were still big protests carrying on into 72, but it wasn't on campuses. So yeah, it had very much had a chilling effect.
Because I remember in the beginning of the book, some of the students are talking about how Nixon lied about the war, that he was now escalating it. And even the parents were talking about it at times. There was a couple scenes of their disappointment with what he was doing. So, I mean, I guess he saw the light at one point that the war was not going to let him keep the presidency, basically. But it had nothing to do.
Sure, that. I mean, he knew when he took office that the war was lost. I mean, LBJ knew the war was lost. I mean, we know that now from the later revelations by, the big shots in charge, that they knew the war was lost in like 66, and they kept waging it. I mean, sort of similar to what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. Very similar. So it's the same kind of, mix of, politics is war, war is politics. They're inseparable. And so that's what we saw then. And then the politics are different now, but the end result is still the same. It's this huge debacle, and many, many people lose their lives.
Now, the quote that you referred to about being able to create the unseen is like something I came across. The power of comics lies in creating the unseen. Are you going to take that to other work?
If appropriate. I certainly did it in My Friend Dahmer.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely.
There's a lot of the scenes in My Friend Dahmer. That's not documented. There's only a handful of photos from that time, but it covers our friendship together. That's the basis of My Friend Dahmer. We were friends. We went to the same junior high and high school, and we were friends from roughly age 12 until age 18. And then 2 weeks after our high school graduation, he killed his first victim and became the monster. So it's the story of the spiral down. It's not the story of the crimes. And a lot of that, there were very few photos of that time. There's no film footage or anything like that. That stuff, material in that book, either came from my own memories, my own papers, the memories of some of my friends, or sometimes from Dahmer himself, because, he gave many interviews over the course of once he was caught. He was caught in July 91 and then killed in prison, I believe, in November 93. Is that right? It's been a long time since I talked about My Friend Dahmer. I'm forgetting my facts and figures. But he gave a lot of interviews during that time. Mm-hmm. And so, it'd be like a little sentence, this happened. And I would have that sentence. I'm like, oh man, I know exactly where that happened. I know the land, the landscape. I know the topography. I could create that as in some cases, a 10-page scene, just from a little, line that he gave in an interview. So, that was where I really kind of mastered that technique.
As you just described, you're really a one-man show, and you're dealing with something like My Friend Dahmer or Kent State. Do you find these getting it out onto the page somewhat physically or emotionally exhausting at times? How do you keep yourself going and also protect yourself at times, especially with some of the subject matter that,
right.
Especially those two books?
Sure. Yeah. At a certain point with My Friend Dahmer, I just kind of detached from the story. it was pretty dark when I sat down and wrote the final narrative, and it didn't take long because I'd been working on it for a long time at that point. But yeah, that was a couple of weeks that weren't a lot of fun. I tend to write, well, My Friend Dahmer and Kent Stater, I did write a script for both just to kind of organize my thoughts. The fictional books I've done, I don't. Make of that what you will. And then I thumbnail everything. That's really writing for me, is I sit down and I make these little sketches of pages where I write the narrative and write kind of sketching the visual very roughly. And so I'm always seeing it, words and pictures together. So writing that script and writing those, maybe a little less so the thumbnail, because then I'm concentrating on the nuts and bolts of making comics. That was very dark with My Friend Dahmer. And then when I got into the story, as I said, I detached emotionally, just kind of set it aside and went up to the side and focused on the details of the scenery and the settings, because that was also my world. It was my high school, it was my mall, it was my town, and recreating those, that was fun. Mm-hmm. So that's how I was able to find a little bit of joy in that book, which otherwise, no, it was very, very dark. Kent State was different. I mean, Kent State, I wasn't part of it. I'm an outsider. So I had that distance.
Yeah.
Now, when interviewing people who were there, and I interviewed, probably 50 students of 1970. I mean, those interviews invariably would end with the interviewee in tears. I can't tell you how many times that happened. I mean, it's still so powerful for them. They've never shaken that experience, And they would all apologize for breaking down. I'm like, man, don't worry about it. I mean, but I didn't have that kind of attachment to that book, so it was easier for me to write that. But yeah, the end of the book was tough. I mean, those last 15 pages were hard to write. They were hard to draw, especially to draw, because it's bloody. And I've gotten to know these kids as I researched this book, and here I am writing their deaths. I mean, that was tough.
And did you sort of limit the hours at the drawing board when you're doing stuff like that? Do you have, another way of sort of having more, something in the tank for tomorrow's work? Do you have?
Yeah, yes and no. With My Friend Dahmer, I was still doing my comic strip and other work. So, I mean, I had like another job as well. And that was a much more leisurely pace because it took place over such a long period of time. Kent State was a much more, I was just doing Kent State. And that was a really hard deadline. And yeah, that was tough. But I mixed it up by traveling a lot because I do all these comics events and book tours and things. So I would go off to, France for a month on tour, and then I'd come back and I'd work on Kent State some more. So that helped a little.
So as you said earlier that you wish you had another year for Kent State. Oh, okay, because you were in France for a month or two.
It was still a tough. Well,
yeah.
Your commitments, you got to sell your books.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, I mean, all my books are, out in Europe as well, and I get invited to an event. So, I mean, you still have to sell your books. I mean, it's, you just can't focus on just one. I suppose you could, but I don't.
The reason why I reached out to you is because I want to change the subject, is about censorship. Mm-hmm. And when, a few months back, when Mouse, did they eventually pull it? Yes, I think they did pull it from the high school library.
I think it was
or a public
high school library in some shithole in Kentucky somewhere. I forget.
Yeah, it was because of this one moment where there's a naked mouse.
Right. Yeah, totally ridiculous.
And you were talking about, but where have you people been? Where have you been? Because this is actually something that has been going on. And just recently we had Fun Home get pulled in Connecticut from a high school library.
Right.
And as we were talking before we started recording, this is a game plan. And now, because of, as some people think, Mouse is like the only comic book or original graphic novel that was ever made, now people paid attention. But what have you been seeing? This goes back, what is the agenda, basically to blow
Well,
up.
the agenda is to win elections. I
Yeah,
mean, this is how they're energizing the base.
energize the base. Yeah.
You get these quote unquote outraged parents
Mm-hmm.
who rise up in a school district, and these parents are maybe their parents, maybe they're not. I mean, a lot of times school board meetings are flooded with out of town players who come in to swell numbers and do all kinds of other things. One of the groups behind it, well, one of the major groups behind it, the think tanks, a lot of it comes from the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah.
A lot of it comes from the Kochs.
Yep.
And there's another group, I think it's a think tank funded by, or a PAC, super PAC funded by one of the Schlitz beer heirs, who was a virulent homophobe. And these are the major players behind it. And one of the groups that really puts this into action is a group called the Parental Rights Coalition, which is a designated hate group, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. They've been around since the 70s. And their big thing was opposing gay marriage, which they were, the front lines of that for 20 years. Mm-hmm. And now they've pivoted to purging libraries and purging school curriculum of any gay lit. And of course, they zero in on comics because, the right wing always zeroes in on comics. Mm-hmm. Back to the comic book witch hunts of the 1950s, essentially.
And the whole thing, comics are for kids, which they haven't been, and they aren't in other countries,
Right. No, and they haven't been for years here. It's not she and Jughead, you know, having a gay affair, though that would be an awesome comic. And that's where they're focusing. And so they're going after, as I told you before, I mean, Mouse was a mistake. Somebody veered from the strategy and went after Mouse, and it blew up in their face.
Yep.
Because, it's not about, there's nothing there that's objectionable. It's, you get into the questions of anti-Semitism. You go after a book that's won a Pulitzer Prize, so that really hasn't slowed them down in other instances. And it was a mistake, and I don't think it'll be repeated. I don't think Mouse will be targeted again. All it did was send Mouse shooting back up the bestseller list, which Spiegelman didn't really need. The books that are really paying the price are queer comics, and Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe is the one that is targeted most frequently, and there are a few others. But that's the one. They're going after these personal memoirs of usually coming out.
Yeah.
And that's what they're attacking. And they're saying it's child porn. They're grooming children to be, to turn into transsexual or just become, reject their parents and their religion, blah, 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 blah. And so that's where they're targeting it. Home is a distraction to a certain point, because that's been so critically acclaimed, and rightly so. They're really going after these lesser-known books by lesser-known authors because they feel that, that's an easy target, and it has been for them.
And it's coming off of, in Connecticut, the same names that I saw in Unmask that were, yelling for Unmask My Child, in schools. They've now pivoted to this.
Yeah, it's just they're culture warriors. Yeah, they're taking these marching orders and they're trying to energize their base, and it's working to a certain extent. And they go after school board members. I mean, they're very specifically targeting school boards. They flood elections with a right-wing slate of candidates so they can take over the board all at once. And this is all a playbook coming down from Washington. And the Heritage Foundation. I mean, this is the playbook. This is the culture war that's being fought right now. And, progressives really need to wake the hell up, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of urgency that I see coming from the left. I mean, I've been yelling about this since I became a target of it. Mm-hmm. My Dahmer was one of 16 books targeted at a school district in suburban Austin. And, we were called everything. I mean, I was called a sex criminal by one of these parents, quote unquote, for writing a book about, that won a bunch of awards. I'm a sex criminal. I mean, that's the kind of language they're using. And so it's no fun when your work is targeted like this, and there are no filters on these people. Doesn't matter to them how many awards it won. It doesn't matter how many languages translated into or how many printings there have been. You are a pervert, and that's who they're coming after. Another one they're coming after is Handmaid's Tale, both the written version and the graphic novel version. That is a very frequent. I mean, obviously, if you're a Christian nationalist, you're not going to approve of that book. So I mean, this is their agenda and this is their strategy. Now lately it's been derailed somewhat by some of the crap that's blown up over the last few months. So that's good.
What is that? What exactly? I mean, this seems to be an evergreen thing for them, anyways, on motivating their. And where I'm from is that I was surprised that they're even trying it in Connecticut. And they're succeeding. They succeeded in this one town, but they've attacked our local library just without. I'm like, they can't try to go censor things. They're just saying they've made up other lies about the library to just shut it down. And also, the Heritage Foundation, what little I know about the Koch brothers, as libertarians, they don't believe in public education
or public libraries.
The end of what their true agenda is just to tear it all down. I mean, if we're going back that.
Getting back to the Weathermen, burn it all down. Very definitely they are, except they have a lot more money and a lot more influence than the Weathermen ever had. I mean, it's certainly the greatest challenge I think we're going to face in our lifetime is this extended culture war. How much are they going to destroy by the time or are they going to succeed? I mean, there's this, let's not fool ourselves to think that their defeat is inevitable. I don't think that's true at all.
So when Dahmer came on the radar for them, what did you feel? I mean, you're like, this is nothing that you were trying to do. You were just trying to tell the story that you know, right? I mean, they're just making stuff up. Is that correct? I mean,
yeah. I mean, My Friend Dahmer is, it's a tough sell. I mean, I'm not going to deny that it's not, but it's piled up a number of YA awards, a couple from the American Library Association. It's gotten a lot of accolades. So it's been introduced because of that. It got introduced into a lot of high school curriculum. And it's kind of a natural fit because it's about high school. It's about bullying. It's about the indifference of the adult world. It's about kids who fall through the cracks. I mean, it's, in many ways, it's a perfect book for high school kids. They seem to really enjoy it. But I always recognized that was not my design. I mean, I just backed into that, I was just trying to tell the story I wanted to tell. But I mean, I understand why it's been targeted, but there's, whatever, it's usually targeted by people, of course, invariably targeted by people who, one, have never read it and really have no idea what it's about. So they just think, well, it's about a gay serial killer. And have you read Dahmer's, what Dahmer did to people and, the crimes he committed? Well, yeah, but none of that is in the book. That's not what this story is. So, I wasn't surprised, but it's not a lot of fun to be targeted by these people. I mean, it's, because, there's also the danger that they're going to come after you. What we see now is that, they bring legal action against people, they dox people, they harass people. I mean, in terms of school boards and librarians, you'll get like a crowd of right-wing protesters marching up and down in front of their house carrying signs about, a pedophile lives here and stuff like that. I mean, there is no dirty trick that these people will not take on. So, it's, what they want to do is they want to intimidate people into silence. And like I said, there's not a lot of urgency from the allies in the left that are out there. And there's not a lot of, we don't have the financial backing that these right-wing groups have. And it's not a fair fight right now. The one thing that we have on our side is, truth and reason. We'll see how far that goes.
Yeah, which people have been hitting at that forever. So, well, I guess one last question is, how do we get the people who believe in books and supporting libraries motivated? Have you thought about that? And how do you create a movement of pushback? Have you ever thought about that?
Well, I'm not an organizer, but
Yeah.
somebody higher up than mere comics creators needs to start raising a stink about this. I mean the big shots in Washington or in state houses or wherever, somebody needs to start talking about this stuff, or in media. And I just don't see a lot of it. They did when Mouse got nabbed, and then they ranted about that for a week, and then it went away.
Yep.
But the campaign has not stopped. Those people are right back out there purging libraries right now, as we speak, right now. And not in just one place. I mean, we're talking dozens and dozens of districts, dozens and dozens of counties. I mean, they're everywhere.
And it's not even red states. I'm sorry. It's not even red states. It's happening in blue states. It's happening. Yeah, like you said.
Well, it's happening in red parts of blue states.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how they operate. They build from the bottom up, where the left tends to build from the top down. And, I don't know. I mean, the right seems to be pretty effective at this strategy. That's how they pulled off everything they pretty much pulled off. And so it's working for them. And if we're not going to have any pushback, we're going to lose that fight.
And that's one thing I have noticed, is that being involved in local politics, of the changes that can occur in this town and how it sort of spreads beyond. And I don't know if we've talked about it yet, but the playbook that we were talking about before we started recording, there's a playbook to this. And
Yes.
and I think it's easier to sort of build from small town to small town to change this government. You're seeing a militia take over a small town in Shasta, California.
Yeah.
You morph these governments until all of a sudden now they're in the state level, and then they make the jump from the state to the federal level. But at the state level, you're making laws. The state of Connecticut, basically, when it looked like Roe versus Wade's going to be turned over, state acted immediately, but then that can be turned around,
Sure.
Say in 5 years. The other thing is that the Heritage Foundation is not only well funded, they're patient too.
Yeah.
So,
church.
yeah.
They think it's centuries.
Mm-hmm.
Even though you got a state like here in Ohio, which is basically a purple state, 50-50, it actually leans slightly blue, but it is completely controlled by the Republican Party because of extreme gerrymandering.
Yeah.
And now they've got the toadies in place in the federal court system that say, well, that's okay. And so, I mean, we're really in a stranglehold here, and it feels an awful lot like the end of representative democracy to me. And that's really what it's all about. And all of this other stuff comes into play. And as authors and as literary people, I mean, we're kind of I don't want to use that term. I mean, we're certainly at the front edge of it. And what's happening to us is going to happen to everybody else if they have their way.
I guess our hour is up on that note. So, Derf, thank you for happy note. But this is what I wanted to talk about and stuff, and just sort of, it's one way of getting the word out. I don't know how, to people who listen, and just, check out your Twitter account. Definitely, anybody who likes this interview.
I do amplify whatever comes my way. But like I said, there aren't a lot of people who are doing that. But
yeah.
I seem to be shouting into the wind, honestly. So I'd much appreciate if somebody would pay attention.
Well, I listened. It was great, and I have, I believe in what you're talking about, and I think there is a fight that needs to be fought here, and some of the pushback. So I'm right there with you. But thank you very much for Kent State. It's a great original graphic novel. My Friend Dahmer too. I think I'm going to go reread them again. So, and I can't wait. I look forward to seeing your next project.
Me too.
Can you talk about it, or is there anything?
No, not really.
Okay. Well, I'll be on Twitter looking out for any announcements. But thank you very much for your time. It was great meeting you. And do you have any other final words? Or?
Oh, that's it.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I'll talk to you later. Okay.
All right, bye.
See ya. Bye.